Now, if you just listened, and I hope you did, to what Rachel had to say about the Supreme Court, you might even want to rewind it and go through that catalog of ethics challenges currently facing the Supreme Court, because that is why the Supreme Court of the United States is in crisis tonight. The Supreme Court is in crisis tonight not because of the relentless cascade of exposés about Republican-appointed Supreme Court justices living outside the rules. The Supreme Court of the United States is in crisis tonight because there are no rules. There are no ethics rules that in any real way control the behavior and choices of Supreme Court justices and their spouses whose income benefits the Supreme Court justices. But Supreme Court justices are not the only people in Washington who, in effect, get to live without rules. There are two more people who get to live that way if they choose to: the president and the vice president. There are no effective ethics rules that can truly control a president or vice president. Like Supreme Court justices, no one can fire the president or the vice president. The only way they can be removed from office is impeachment by a majority of the House of Representatives and conviction by 67 votes in the United States Senate. That's why Chief Justice Roberts said no. That's why he said, I must respectfully decline your invitation, in a letter to the Senate Judiciary Committee chairman, declining to testify to the Judiciary Committee tomorrow about the ethics crisis at the Supreme Court, which now very publicly includes the work and income of Chief Justice Roberts' wife. The word respectfully in that letter really should be changed to politically. Justice Roberts is not respectfully declining the Judiciary Committee's invitation. He is politically declining it, knowing that he has the political power in Congress, Republican political power, to prevent the Congress from taking the only disciplinary action possible against a member of the Supreme Court, which is impeachment. American journalism is very good at digging out scandalous bits of behavior that carry the appearance of impropriety and more. Lately, the Supreme Court has been a rich source of such stories. From the violations of law advocated by Clarence Thomas's wife in her text messages to Donald Trump's last White House chief of staff, while he was devoted, and she was devoted, to trying to overthrow the outcome of the last presidential election. Then came the leak of Samuel Alito's draft opinion overturning Roe versus Wade, which drew attention to a possible previous leak of a draft opinion by Samuel Alito himself. Possible leak by Samuel Alito himself to a billionaire who, like all billionaire friends of Supreme Court justices, only became their friends after they became Supreme Court justices. Then we learned that Clarence Thomas's favorite billionaire, who befriended Clarence Thomas only after Clarence Thomas became a Supreme Court justice, found many ways to provide vacation recreation via private jet and yacht to Clarence Thomas that has allowed Clarence Thomas to vacation like a billionaire. A vacation lifestyle that would cost millions upon millions of dollars if Clarence Thomas were actually trying to provide that for himself. And then came the news that that same billionaire purchased Clarence Thomas's mother's house and improved it for her, allowing her to live rent-free in the house while putting some of the proceeds of the sale of that house directly into Clarence Thomas's pocket as cash from the sale of his mother's house, which Clarence Thomas partially owned. And then we learned that Neil Gorsuch benefited after the head of one of the nation's largest law firms, of all things, decided to purchase a strikingly modest home in Colorado from a Supreme Court justice whose pockets were then lined with some of the proceeds of that real estate sale. I have previously reported on this program that Chief Justice Roberts' wife derives income from many law firms in her work as a headhunter for major law firms. And last week, Insider published a whistleblower affidavit along with internal financial spreadsheets from a former colleague of Jane Roberts, which purport to show that Jane Roberts earned $10.3 million in commissions between 2007 and 2014. Those documents were filed under federal whistleblower protection laws and are now in the hands of House Judiciary Committee members. Chief Justice Roberts' wife, of course, continues to earn that kind of income past 2014. It's nearly 9 years since that income was earned. And of course, Chief Justice Roberts did not disclose the sources of that income in his financial disclosure forms, and he knows he will never pay any price for that because he knows impeachment is politically impossible. American journalism is very good at exposing such potential scandals, but it is very bad at reporting on the people who live scrupulously careful, political, ethical lives, even though there is no effective ethics enforcement to compel them to avoid any appearance of impropriety. We have among us tonight a shining example of ethics rectitude that the Washington Press Corps will never, ever report to you. Among the ludicrous legal arguments Mike Pence tried to use to avoid testifying to Jack Smith's grand jury, which Mike Pence finally did last week, was that the argument that Mike Pence was really a United States senator while he was vice president of the United States. Mike Pence claimed that the so-called speech and debate clause of the United States Senate allowed him to avoid testimony, even though it did not allow United States Senator Lindsey Graham to avoid testifying to a grand jury in Georgia. Among the many proofs that the vice president is not a United States senator is that the Senate cannot expel the vice president. All senators can be expelled by a vote of the United States Senate. The Senate has had an ethics committee since 1964. The vice president is not subject to any of the ethics enforcement of the Senate Ethics Committee. The vice president cannot be fired. The president can never fire a vice president because the vice president is constitutionally elected by the voters, just like the president. And so the only disciplinary enforcement that a vice president faces is impeachment, which, of course, is no enforcement at all. In other words, the vice president of the United States can be just as unethical as the most unethical Supreme Court justice, and no one can do anything about that. But the ethical choices made by the vice president, and more particularly by her husband, literally put Chief Justice Roberts and Clarence Thomas to shame. The vice president's husband, Doug Emhoff, was a very high-powered, highly paid lawyer in a major law firm with offices around the world when Kamala Harris was elected vice president. During the transition, when prospective cabinet members were preparing themselves for the Senate confirmation process, the first man in history to be married to the vice president of the United States prepared himself for his new and historic role by quitting his job. He didn't have to do that. He could have continued to derive millions of dollars of income from his law firm, the way the Chief Justice's wife continues to do. But he held himself to a higher standard, a standard that no one has noticed and no one has given him credit for, and no one in the Washington Press Corps will ever give the vice president credit for. They will never get credit. The vice president and her husband will never get credit for presenting to Washington and the country the perfect model of voluntary compliance to the very highest possible ethical standard. Doug Emhoff's work at his Los Angeles law firm largely involved the entertainment business and had zero potential for possible conflicts of interest with the vice president's duties for any hint of impropriety in Doug Emhoff's client list. But he was concerned that maybe one of the lawyers in one of that firm's offices somewhere around the world working on a case that Doug Emhoff knew nothing about might present a hint of impropriety. Perhaps some lawyer working in the London office on a case Doug Emhoff knew nothing about could provoke a question at some point in the White House press briefing room. And Doug Emhoff was not going to allow that to happen. Not a single question, not one. He wasn't going to allow even a whiff of suspicion about his work to ever cloud the work in any way of the Vice President of the United States. And to maintain that standard, Doug Emhoff decided he had to quit his job. That meant giving up millions of dollars of income. And he replaced thousands of dollars of that income with a modest salary from a law school in Washington, D.C., where Doug Emhoff is now teaching law. Washington reporters have no interest in that story because it is the story of doing the right thing, and Washington reporters don't think doing the right thing is news. And that's the problem. Chief Justice Roberts and his wife have always known that the Washington Press Corps does not care if they do the right thing. They would get no credit for doing the right thing, so why do it? Why not just take the tens of millions of dollars of income and suffer what probably would be a short season of press attention in Washington, at best, on the issue of Supreme Court ethics before the Washington Press Corps stops caring about Supreme Court ethics and stops caring about the income derived by the wife of the Chief Justice of the United States. Yes, there are some jobs that are so very important that if your spouse takes that job, you might have to quit your job and do something else. You'll never be hearing about Ketanji Brown Jackson's husband in Supreme Court ethics stories because he's a doctor. That's one of many occupations that can't possibly create any hint of impropriety in the public service of a spouse. It would have been so easy for Clarence Thomas and Chief Justice Roberts' wives to avoid the appearance of impropriety. It was so easy. They just would have had to care. They would have had to care as much as Vice President Kamala Harris cares and her husband, Doug Emhoff, cares about living by the highest ethical standard. Our next guest says that Chief Justice Roberts' refusal to testify to the Senate Judiciary Committee proves, quote, that our Supreme Court does not exist in the constitutional order as much as it looms over it, a robed tribunal of self-styled philosopher kings accountable to no one but themselves.